Hey all. All right, so this is the overview of Module 3B on Nevada state and local politics slash fiscal politics. All right, so I just want to emphasize a few things here, and the rest of it you can pick up in the narrated slides. All right, so I guess number one is, right, there's this thing called Dillon's Rule that essentially says when there's a conflict between state and local government, generally the state prevails. It's kind of like the same thing at the federal level, right, with the supremacy clause in the Constitution. Same idea here. Now, that being said, local governments do have significant autonomy to do their own thing politically. That's called home rule. And I would say the broad trend over the decades has been a trend in the direction of home rule, giving like Clark County or North Las Vegas or Henderson more room to do their own thing politically. Now, that being said, there has been a counter trend in recent years because of our divided politics. And we talked about that in that Module 3A on federalism, that particularly in states controlled by the Republican Party at the state level. It's called the trifecta, when one party controls both houses of the legislature and the governor's office. So there's a good number of states where Republicans hold a trifecta of power, particularly, in the states that you would expect, those in the deep South and some western states, like let's say Utah or Idaho or Wyoming. All right, so you get the idea. But sometimes within those states, you do get local geographies where minorities are a large percentage of the population. Look no further than Texas. Right? We talked about that. Texas. Overall, right, whites are in the majority in Texas, but in certain geographies, right, Latinos are in the majority, or blacks in cities like Houston or San Antonio. So then you get, right, kind of a trend lately away from home rule and back towards centralizing power in the state, legislature, and governor. Right? Because increasingly red states are not happy with the politics playing out in big cities where minorities are a majority. They don't like that at all. Whether it's gun control issues or, what was I going to say? Election issues. Right, those are the big two. So increasingly, Republicans in Republican-dominated states with islands of minority power in cities, they're getting rid of home rule, or at least they're limiting home rule significantly and saying, these are the things you cannot do, right? You cannot enact gun control legislation. You cannot expand access to the vote. Okay, we're going to centralize that power in the hands of the state. So that's been an interesting counter trend in recent years. And it does reflect, right, our increasingly divided politics, divided by race and party. And we've talked about that, right? Race and party in America overlap quite a bit. I think it's super unfortunate, by the way, but there we have it. Okay. I'd say Nevada is still mostly a Dillon's Rule state, albeit we do give local governments significant autonomy. But if there's a conflict, typically the state will win that conflict. And that's happened here a number of times. There was a time when the Nevada legislature and the governor's office here, they were talking about taking over the Clark County School District as a failing school district. That's happened in a lot of states. That's where you see Dillon's Rule most often, when the state takes over what they deem to be a failing school district. That never happened. But if Nevada had wanted to, they could have. But then they're taking on a lot of headaches that they don't really want. Same thing happened here in Nevada during the recession of 2008, when North Las Vegas, at some point, was pretty close to declaring bankruptcy. Right, and the state had threatened to come in and take over their finances. North Las Vegas got it together and avoided that, but if the state had wanted to and take over their finances, they could have. It's not ideal, because you're telling we the people, right, that you no longer have control over your own city. The state's going to take control. It can happen. Detroit, right? Think about Detroit declaring bankruptcy many years ago. Michigan came over and took over their finances and appointed like a czar to make changes to their tax policy and their spending policy to get their books back in balance. Dillon's rule. The other thing I wanted to talk about here were the politics of state and local taxes. So at the state level, it's hard to find those good juicy pie charts. And the ones I think I'm going to post for you on the slides are somewhat dated, but pretty close to where we are even today. These things only change incrementally over time. Right? The dominant source of tax revenue in Nevada at the state level are sales taxes. I think in Clark County they're around 8.2, 8.3%. Right? So we don't have a state income tax. People will say Nevada doesn't have state taxes. I'm like, you're a moron. We definitely have lots of state taxes, but we don't have a state income tax. And I understand sometimes when you say a state tax, you mean income tax. But for purposes of political science, we want to be analytically careful here. We don't have a state income tax, but we do have a relatively high state sales tax. Notably, right, some of that falls onto the shoulders of tourists, right, visitors who engage in high-end retail on the Strip and elsewhere. So tourists do help us pay our state sales tax, no question. The second most important tax revenue source in Nevada, the gaming tax. That's, I think, around 17 or 18% of our total state tax revenue. So far less than the sales tax, which is around 30%, but still quite substantial. And I think gaming corporations here pay 6% of gross revenue, and it adds up to about 17% of the state revenue. Third most important source is what is effectively a corporate income tax. If you Google it, it'll say Nevada does not have a corporate income tax, whatever. Call it what you want. It's called the commerce tax. It's essentially a corporate income tax. That was passed under Governor Sandoval back in 2015. He led an unlikely coalition of all Democrats and some Republicans to get the 2/3 in both chambers to pass a big tax increase on corporations of a certain size, dedicating that revenue to public education K through 12. Good on Sandoval. He was a non-traditional Republican. And that's when Republicans controlled both chambers in Nevada. And Sandoval went a different direction that in some ways alienated him from the Republican Party. And now he's the president of University of Nevada, Reno. I think Republicans here kind of chased him out of politics, at least that kind of politics. All right. And after that, there's kind of a collection of taxes that make up the rest of our revenue. The mining tax, scandalously low. Remember, right, in the state constitution, it's 5% of net revenue, net profits. That's super low. The legislature, last legislative session, before this one, they raised it a bit. So that's been helpful. But mining still doesn't pay their fair share. But we're making progress on that. They have a lot of political muscle, so it's been hard to sort of increase that tax rate. But the legislature did 2 years ago. So that's been helpful. Not a big source, but a source. Marijuana, retail and wholesale has generated some revenue. Not a lot, but a little. It goes to public education K through 12. Although, dollars are fungible, so I'm never quite sure what's the value of dedicating revenue streams to particular budget expenditures, but makes people happy, so whatever. $1 is just like any other dollar. Whether it's a dollar collected through the sales tax, or the mining tax, or the corporate tax, like the dollars all look the same. Anyway, what else? And there's a host of other taxes that add up to the rest of the budget. Okay, so thing to note about that, right, related to state local politics, right? The Allegiant Stadium for the Raiders, right? We enticed Mark Davis to come here from Oakland with the NFL franchise by offering to help build a stadium, Allegiant. Right? We contributed, I think, around $750 million. We did not have that money laying around, obviously, because we're a small state. So we had a float at what's called a bond issue to generate $750 million up front. Now, I think the stadium cost well north of $2 billion. So, we're contributing about a third. But that's a lot, right? To someone who really doesn't need the money, Mark Davis. But whatever. All right, so how did we generate that money up front? We floated a bond issue. What the hell's a bond issue? That's when you say, hey, investors around the globe, hey, investors, we're going to sell off chunks of debt that will add up to $750 million. We're going to raise it right now by selling off bonds to investors, and those investors will make interest on those bonds for the next 20 or 30 years. They'll get their principal back. They'll get interest. They'll make money, but they have to, buy these lines of debt, and we're going to pay those lines of debt back over time, decades, with a bump in the hotel room tax, a higher bump on the Strip corridor, a lower bump valley-wide. And who pays for that, right? Basically visitors. So we're like, coolio. That's how we did that. Now, that's a pretty standard way to do a bond issue, where states can effectively go into debt with a little side game called a bond issue. And that's what they're debating right now, right, in the legislature. Should we do, it's not going to look like that, but it's going to be in the same rough ballpark of getting money up front from the state, supported by breaks for the ownership group of the A's over decades. Don't know what that's going to look like yet, or if it's even going to happen. Okay. What else did I want to say here about state and local politics / fiscal politics? I guess it would be the Public Lands Act from some years ago when Harry Reid was Senate Majority Leader. Here, right, bringing the bacon home to Nevada. He got a law passed, and it's been very good for Nevada in general and Las Vegas in particular. And it basically states that, look, whenever the federal government owns land in a state, and they own a lot here in Nevada, right? About 80%, it is estimated, of the land in Nevada is owned by the feds. When that happens, and the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, that typically manages most of those holdings here in Nevada, when the BLM sells off that land at auction every year to developers, typically land here in the valley, or land around Reno where it's valuable. When they sell that off to developers, the revenue does not go to the federal government per se. It comes right back here to Nevada to fund parks and recreation at the local level. Right? It's been a great deal for Nevada because we have a lot of federal land here. There's revenue from that when it's sold off each year to developers. That's how Lake Las Vegas got built. Developers bought that land from the BLM and then developed it. Those revenues go to Parks and Rec, to building parks. Typically it's building parks, not the annual expenses of maintaining a park, but to build it. So that's how we get most of our parks here in the valley, is from federal dollars. Woo! It's pretty unique. Pretty unique. All right. One other thing I guess I should mention, increasingly state and local, I should mention this as well, right? So those are state taxes. So it's the sales tax, the gaming tax, the corporate income tax, essentially, and then a host of other taxes, including mining, marijuana, and then hotel room taxes and all, entertainment taxes, insurance taxes, on and on. Now, we should distinguish that from local taxes. Now, a lot of people don't, but you should if you're a good political scientist. Local taxes. Okay, those are typically property taxes. Okay, property taxes. They are, in my view, and the view of almost everybody who looks at it from a scholarly point of view, our property taxes here are scandalously low. I know my wife and I pay less than $1,000 a year in property taxes. And that's just crazy. We moved here from Wisconsin many years ago, where we paid thousands of dollars a year on a property worth far less. So they're crazy low here. Crazy low. And the amount they can increase in a given year is capped at around 4%. No matter how much the value of your property goes up, the property taxes can only go up by a maximum of 4% a year, something like that. So we're big on low property taxes here. All right. Now, what do property taxes go to pay for? Well, they go to pay for, number one, public safety. Public education, K through 12. That is by far the largest budget item for local governments, K through 12 public education. Second, public safety, law enforcement, metro, firefighters, that sort of thing. And then third will be parks and recreation at the bottom. They get the crumbs. Almost all of it's vacuumed up by public education and public safety. So what does that mean here in Nevada? It means we grossly underfund both public education and public safety. And I don't know about public safety, because I think we do pretty well with that. Metro is well funded. Public education. Now, that property tax that we have is not nearly adequate, not even close to what we need for public education. It comes way short, way short. It's a scandal. So the bulk of our funding for public education K through 12 comes from the state sales tax, which is crazy. It's crazy. We put a lot on that state sales tax. I don't know if any other state does it that way. Because almost always, the conventional wisdom in political science is, where do you get funding for public education? Local property taxes. We've gone a different road here. I understand, right? People don't love taxes. People don't love property taxes. It's politically desirable to keep those as low as possible, but you also have to be responsible. And I think we have not been fully responsible on that front. And as a result, right, we shift funding to the state for public education, which I guess, is sort of okay. But if we doubled the property taxes here, which would be still super low, that's how low they are. If you doubled them, they'd still be really low. If you doubled them, just imagine, right, the additional funding for public education. Then, right, both the state and local governments, they also generate revenue by providing services and selling those services, right? User fees. Tuition at CSN, a user fee. Right? Tuition at UNLV, a user fee. Registering your car each year with the DMV, a user fee. Renewing your registration and license, user fee. Some would say traffic tickets are user fees to generate revenue for local governments. Right? And then there is sometimes a question about that. And it can be a very legitimate question. Right? When is aggressive traffic enforcement legitimate in terms of public safety, which is a very real thing? Right? And when is that being used somewhat more cynically as a fundraiser for local police departments? It's a fair question to ask always. Right? And I don't want to be too hard on law enforcement, because often, right, what they're doing is they're enforcing laws to provide for public safety. I value that a very great deal. But at what point do they sort of pitch over? And you get some of these civil forfeiture laws. I don't know what they are in Nevada, but if they're typical of those around the country, law enforcement is sometimes incentivized to seize cars in particular, but also boats, from people who are either directly or tangentially involved in suspected drug dealing. And you don't even have to end up getting a conviction on these people to get their assets. The civil forfeiture laws can be super loose. And I'm not sure they provide the best incentive for law enforcement. Like, they might be like, wow, that guy's got a really nice Land Rover. Or the ones I've heard of as being more abusive. Again, I don't know what the boundaries are in Nevada, but the ones I've seen that can be more abusive is you've got an elderly a woman, right? Her son is, let's say, 30 or 40 years old. They're dealing drugs. They're living with their mom, and the mom has a Land Rover that she's earned on her own, doing whatever it is she does. Right? And then they'll seize her Land Rover, saying she's living with a suspected drug dealer, kind of a thing. It can be that loose, and it can be a bit abusive. I don't love that. There were some efforts to reform some of those. But in the 80s, back in the day, when there was the war on drugs thing, we went really far. And that was one of the things we did. And it, incentivized them to go after the bad guys, so to speak. But it's become somewhat sketchy in some jurisdictions. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Try to keep these at 20 minutes. Thanks.